In 1967, Patrick McGoohan starred in the weirdest, wildest television show that had ever been made. The Prisoner ran for just one season of just 17 episodes, but it has influenced visual storytelling ever since. It is a strange show that begins in the real world and ends in a surreal spectacle of pure imagination. At its core, the show is a meditation on the impossibility of individualism. We are all prisoners of our social and political context, and even that context has a larger global context. To understand this is to risk despair at never being able to change your environment. When I first saw the show in 1993, I was enthralled. Watching it was a key reason I eventually pursued a degree in political science and read the literature of post-Cold War globalization. I still binge watch the show now and again every few years. In episode 2, Free for All, the protagonist, the prisoner of the title, is offered a chance to become the warden of the strange prison, the village, that holds him. If he wins an election, he will learn the identity of Number One, the mysterious power behind the village. Spoiler alert, the series wants us to wonder about the identity of Number One, but how well does any man really know himself? I am joined today by Gareth Roberts, a legendary writer of television and fiction. He has a Substack, actually two of them, one of which, The Culture Bunker, is devoted to analyzing The Prisoner and another classic ITV television series, Blake's Seven. We're going to discuss this episode, Free for All, and try to demystify it. Gareth, welcome to my very first podcast conversation on Osborne Inc. You are my first guest.
Nice to be here. Lovely.
Gareth, it's my opinion that someone who is completely new to this show could watch this single episode, Free for All, and get the gist of the entire series. It is, in my mind, the most important episode because of what it says about the village and as allegory about us. Just by way of introduction, what makes this episode important to the series in your mind?
I think the most important practical thing straight away is that it's written by Patrick McGoohan and directed by Patrick McGoohan, as well as starring him, as all the episodes are. So I think that helps us to understand exactly where he was coming from, particularly compared to other people on the production. It's very different from most of the other scripts. It's a lot more symbolic. It's a lot more allegorical. It steers mostly almost away from the reality, the background, the spy story of the prisoner. Although that's there, but it moves away from it. So it's interesting in what it tells us about McGoohan and his attitude towards this show. I think also for the reasons you say, it's very good at laying out exactly what is going on with the village and its hierarchy and its politics, and shows you exactly where the prisoner is in relation to everything around him. And as you were saying in the introduction, that sort of goes from his immediate social context and then out into the world. On another level, it's just extremely well made. And luckily, it's one of the few early episodes in the shoot, the long shoot for the series, where the exteriors of the village were filmed at Portmeirion, the village in Wales, a real life sort of architectural folly village. And that means that it looks fantastic throughout. The location shooting is really, really good. And it was all done in September of 1966. And September in Wales, you would not expect to have such good weather, let me tell you. But they were blessed. And usually the sky is beautifully blue, the birds are singing, the grass is green. It looks amazing, and it looks like it could be anywhere, which is kind of the point. So that was very fortunate. So on a production level, it's immaculate. There's hardly anything that goes wrong. There's hardly any moment where you're confused by something unintentionally, or that doesn't really ring out everything that's in it. Every scene gets kind of it's realized really, really well. Just from things like the blocking is always good, the cameras where they are, the sound design is really good. It looks $1 million. I mean, particularly for a TV series, particularly in 1967, it looks phenomenal and extraordinary, and it's got lots of phenomenal and extraordinary things happening in it. So it's one of the most visually striking episodes of a very visually striking series. But definitely that location shooting gives it an added sheen. So I think you're right for those reasons, that it's something that kind of sums the whole thing up. Strangely enough, as I'm talking to you, I'm writing the next entry for the next episode in the shoot, which is called Checkmate. And in that, I say, well, actually, that Checkmate is the episode that kind of sums everything up. But I think I was looking at it more from the production point of view and the kind of writer point of view of this would get the message across to the viewer of what the setup is. And Checkmate certainly does that. It's very much more straightforward. It's almost like a wartime prisoner of war, prison camp escape story. But Free for All has all the great qualities that Checkmate has, but it also has something pushing far wider into surrealism and into quite serious political thought, and it's far further out there.
Speaking of the sort of perfect way that this show is made, at times.
Mm.
In the opening montage of the show, we see number 6, the prisoner of the title, zoom at us from out of the distant horizon in a kit car. In other words, it's a car that he has built with his own hands. So there's already something libertarian about this character. And then we see him walking into the subterranean halls of power. He's resigning from his role in some sort of nameless agency. And it's worth recalling that at this time, when the show was made, MI6 was still officially a state secret. Everyone was forbidden to even acknowledge its existence.
Yeah.
So we see our protagonist kind of in that world, pounding his fist on the desk, which rattles the teacup of the person who is seated there. And then we watch the office machinery of the state delete him from service, file him away with this inhuman disinterest. And meanwhile, he drives to his London home. He's packing a suitcase. He's preparing to leave for a desert island, somewhere that, a man can be an island. Of course, no man can be an island. And we see this mysterious cabbie blow knockout gas into the flat through the keyhole. So our protagonist wakes up in this village where the show takes place, and he is told that he is now number 6, and he says famously, "I am not a number, I am a free man."
Where am I? In the village. What do you want? Information. Whose side are you on? That would be telling. We want information.
Information. Information.
You won't get it. By hook or by crook, we will. Who are you? The new number 2. Who is number 1? You are number 6. I am not a number. I am a free man.
And then number 2, who is the voice of authority, indulges in this haughty laughter. And the entire plot of the series has been contained in this opening. He's being held against his will by a system of unlimited power, a surveillance state, in fact, that's going to use every psychological manipulation to discover the truth about why he resigned. So someone can start watching midway through the series and catch right up to the idea of the show.
Yeah.
It's perfect storytelling. Who made this show intro, and why doesn't anyone make TV like this anymore?
I'm not. It's strange. I think actually they didn't really make TV like that then, and I don't think people have made it really before or since. I think The Prisoner is very unique in this. The whole sequence when it's 90 seconds, the sequence of him being abducted, but when the series sort of solidifies into its normal run and you have a standard title sequence, it takes 3 minutes of time, which is a lot, but it's quite a complicated concept to get across. Very unusual for a TV series. If you look at the other series being made at that time by ITC, with a production company, it was based in Britain, but mainly making things for the international, for which read American market. Their title sequences are usually very short, very to the point, very simple. So if you look at The Baron, which was the first color TV series that ITC made, which was the year before. I mean, he is an antique dealer that solves crimes and beats people up. And basically, the title sequence is photographs of him, photographs of antiques, and a few shortcuts of him beating people up and glamorous women screaming and cars tearing around corners. And that's it. And it's done in 30 seconds. So that's where it's coming from. But I think they realized that this was a very hard concept for people to grasp. So it needed to be retold every week. And also, I think it, particularly for people then that couldn't rewind or watch again or stop and go back, that kind of seeing the resignation became more intriguing, because you're constantly wondering what happened, why did he do it, what is he shouting, where was he going, all those questions. So it sort of gives you another chance at seeing it. Whereas I think if it had been seen once at the beginning, it would have been quite hard for people coming in later on to make sense of what was going on. So I think it really needed that 3 minutes. What I notice is that amount of time out of what was then a 50-minute slot with ads coming up to an hour is quite a lot of time out of a script. So I think particularly in some of the early ones, when you look at the shooting scripts, there's quite a lot cut. In Free for All, there's a good 2 or 3 minutes of material that was shot or never got shot that isn't in the final version. So I think the title sequence does take a lot out of that. But as you say, we don't do things like that anymore. But I can't think of another series that needed that amount of explanation every week at the top. Because most pitches in TV and film are, the famous Hollywood idea of 25 words or less. And it's getting less and less, I mean, if you think of modern TV series, you think of The Walking Dead, I mean, that's got quite a long intro sequence. But, it's just zombies. We all know, there's been a zombie. That's it. The Sopranos, there are some gangsters in New Jersey. That's all you need to know. And most TV is like that. The Prisoner, even if you try to distill it down to the shortest possible way of saying it, has all manner of qualifications. He's a secret agent. He's resigned. We don't know why he's resigned. We don't know who's kidnapped him. We don't know where he's been taken to. We don't know why they want him. There's so many questions that have to be posited every week, which you couldn't do in a sort of 30-minute photo montage, I don't think. So that's why they've done it. But it is a beautiful sequence. It's so well done. And as you say, it goes really nicely from that open sky and that feeling of openness and individuality into the kind of small, strange world of the village.
Yeah, speaking of pitch meetings, I have a mental image of McGoohan in a room with TV executives saying, "It's Danger Man, but it's weird."
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, it was kind of like that. I mean, who he was pitching to was Lord Lou Grade, who was a sort of titan of the British entertainment industry for decades. And his son Michael Grade is still a kind of a big cheese in the TV world. It might be his nephew actually. But Lord Grade was this kind of, kind of everyone's idea of a Hollywood or media magnate. He was, the fur coat, the big cigar, all those kind of stereotypes were true about him. And he backed a lot of winners, and he owned ITC basically, and it was a powerhouse. And he was responsible for things like bringing the Muppet Show to being, and I think the American networks had turned it down. So he had a good eye for things in general. He was also the Jerry Anderson puppet series, things like that. But I think what happened with McGoohan was that he was the highest paid star on British TV at that time. He was a very, very famous actor. And he'd been in Danger Man, was the spy series, for years, and was very, very popular. And that's a good show, as we'll get onto in a bit, I think. So when he was coming in to see Lou Grade with this idea, he'd had the power to stop Danger Man. He'd said, "I've had enough of this and I want to do something else." And at that point, in that position, he could do anything. And now many people have had this power, actors and stars, but nobody's ever really done anything like this with it. And that's a sort of testament to McGoohan's oddness. But yes, I think Lou Grade's quote was, he sort of listened to it very quickly because he was very much a come in, pitch to me first thing in the morning and get out kind of man. McGoohan said, well, unloaded his storyline and said, well, it's a spy, he gets captured and everything. And Lou Grade just said, well, it sounds so crazy. Yeah, I'll put the money in your account, go and do it. Which is a remarkable thing to happen. But McGoohan had such a strong pedigree and had such power in the star system that he could have done anything at that point, I think.
when the show was made, McGoohan, as you say, was at the end of a 4-run series as John Drake, Danger Man. And that had taken place from 1960 to 1968. It's in the nature of British television that a series is not always sequential by year.
Yeah.
But to me, it's an important frame of reference for the success of the show that it happened at the very moment the American public was losing faith in government. That was 1968, 1969. And to
Yeah.
what extent do you think did McGoohan conceive this show as a commentary on the archetype of the secret agent or John Drake, the character he'd had to play? And do you think The Prisoner could still work without Danger Man? Or is that framing device of the spy who is held against his will, is that vital to the story? I argue that it is essential, but what do you think?
I think you're right. I think that if you take that away, which people have tried to do, and McGoohan himself wrote a movie script for The Prisoner in about 1989-90, where the character, he as the character that was the prisoner is now number 2 of the village, basically, in that, but never mind that. But the prisoner character in his script is a marine biologist or something. So it becomes a very kind of different setup. And for me, that kind of weakens it, and taking the Cold War out of it makes it flabby and weird, and takes away the sort of urgency and reality and the political reality of that time from it. I think that Danger Man is incredibly important in a way that we can't quite understand watching The Prisoner now. But at the time in 1967, when this came on, you would think this was about John Drake. It's quite possible that the only reason the character is not called John Drake is because they realized they would have to pay the creator of Danger Man royalties and they didn't want to. I mean, to all intents and purposes, he just seems exactly the same character. I mean, you look at McGoohan playing different parts in different shows, and he has quite a good range. I mean, he's always very intense and odd and notable, and very much, every performance is a McGoohan performance, but they're all quite different. The Prisoner, the character, and John Drake are really the same person. You can't really tell any difference between them. The difference comes because the prisoner is in the prison. He's in the village, so he can't trust anyone. He can't talk to anyone and can't confide in anyone. And whereas John Drake was a loner in that sort of Bond spy tradition, he at least could interact with the world on a reasonable level. Even just casually and distantly, he was in the real world. So I think with McGoohan in The Prisoner, he's a lot more angry, he's a lot sharper. He doesn't get those kind of flirty moments or lighter moments that he does get in Danger Man occasionally. So there is that difference, but really, essentially, I always see it as the same character. And I think the viewers certainly would have done. I mean, a lot of a Danger Man episodes, it doesn't have a title sequence of its own, really. It has a tiny little ident at the beginning, but over the theme music, it's usually him driving around London in a car. So The Prisoner beginning with him driving around London in a car, people would think, oh, it's just Danger Man. So I think the spy thing is pretty essential. I think with the I only saw it the once, but the 2008 remake of The Prisoner, ITV made, that again sort of fudged the Cold War angle of it for obvious reasons, because it's set now and there is no Cold War. But I think it's kind of vital to the setup that if you don't have that paranoia of who's in charge, what side has got me, are they trying to make me defect, is it my own side trying to check up on me, then you lose a hell of a lot of the impetus of the thing.
You would lose that sense of betrayal, that this might be my own side. And eventually we discover in the series that his own side is participating in whatever this is.
Well, do we kind of, maybe? It's all, again, that's all left vague. Some people might be and some people might not be. It's left all over the place, really. You can't quite decide.
Right, because what I'm saying is that there's no safety in the outer world. He doesn't have anyone he can turn to. Yeah.
No, I mean, the one time he very definitively gets out, he's dropped straight back in there again, and that's very ambiguous.
Yes.
But yeah, there's a lovely feeling in that episode, which comes about halfway through Many Happy Returns, where he gets back to Britain, and there are he meets a woman who's quite normal, and has a sort of normal conversations with her, and he's quite ratty with her, and she goes, "Oh, what's wrong?" And it's like him beginning to realize, "Oh my God, these are real people." And of course, inevitably, she turns out to be number two of the village, and it's all a trap. But what's really nice about it is that when you do see the outside world in The Prisoner, it's often almost hyper real for an ITC show. It's not a glamorous world. It just seems like real people hanging about, but you don't get to see that very often for obvious reasons.
In the opening minutes of Free for All, number 6 is in his flat, or number 2 is trying to invite himself inside.
Yeah.
And the door opens by itself to let him inside because everything is centrally controlled, and we get to see how everything is controlled from this little room. And incredibly, number two wants number six to run for mayor of the village. So it's a prison that holds elections for warden, which is weird.
Yeah.
And number six, he's immediately suspicious. He remains so until halfway through the episode. And at the end of the episode, a new number two appears, as always. So fans have been talking about this ever since, the changing of the number twos, the changing of the guard, so to speak. There's a certain amount of mystery to it that people make much of it. This actor appeared and then reappeared later. This actor appeared as number two, but did not reappear. People make a lot of that, but am I correct that number two is just this big guest star slot for the series? That this is
Yeah.
a creative compromise fans have just elevated through speculation?
Yeah. I mean, it's on the problem they've got with this show as a concept is that you can't have regular characters, because that would imply some kind of relationship, and also the problem with a show where you have the same villain every week is that, well, the villain's either going to win or be defeated, and it quickly gets tired. I think what they did was quite clever in that they have a different opponent every week playing the same role, and they're almost what's very interesting from an acting point of view is that the characters of each number two is kind of written the same, that they all on paper, if you read the scripts, they're all kind of written as this kind of quite candid, friendly, amenable, English upper class public school chap. But because they're played by such a wide variety of actors and actresses, it's really interesting to see what they bring to it. So you have Mary Morris, who's like, a lady quite advanced in middle age at one point. So that's very interesting. Things like that, you get those curveballs. But yeah, I mean, I think what's fun about it, I think there's a great quote from, I think, McGoohan or the producer David Tomlin, who said what it was meant to be reminiscent of was that feeling of, which happens more and more in the modern world, is where you have a relationship, say, with a functionary at some institution, say you're like your bank manager in the olden days, which is the example they used, and you're just beginning to get a rapport with that person. And then one day you go in and they say, oh, no, it's me now. That person's gone. And you have to start all over again. And I've heard that from so many people in their jobs nowadays, liaising with various people in, the service industries that we're all supposed to be so excited about, how it keeps changing, how there's such a churn. And so, projects are started, and then suddenly there's a new head of department, all that kind of thing. So it's very good at factoring that in, slightly ahead of its time. I think that there's a new manager every so often. So that's a good thing. And it all adds to the sort of mad tapestry of it. It's all, I mean, one of the great things about this show is that every last bit of it is kind of fascinating in its own way. So the design is fascinating, the actors are fascinating, the setup is fascinating. And so you get things like the role of number two is just really interesting. So there's so much going on.
Who is your favorite number two, by the way?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I really like them all. I think even in the weaker episodes, the number two actor always delivers. Going back to Mary Morris, I think there's just something really beguiling about her. But Leo McKern's so good. I mean, Darren Nesbitt is fantastic. It's really, really hard to pick one. Colin Gordon is another one that's kind of different. He's kind of a bit nervous and a bit ratty. Yeah, it's really hard to pick. I couldn't say.
The village does not have a police force. One of the things that is suggested merely by being a village is that this prison relies on other means than force. That's throughout the
Yes.
series. And instead of a police force, this village has a big white bubble. It's actually a weather
Yeah.
balloon. and it subdues anyone who tries to escape. And for me, it works because it will land on people's faces and smother them, which, is
Yeah.
a frightening thought. Um, and here again, the story behind the prop is actually about television and not so much storytelling.
Yeah.
Uh, i- in this episode, for instance, we see two of these rover balloons uh, holding up Patrick McGoohan in the water as he mutters the political slogans that have been programmed into him. I believe it's the only time we see two of them at once. I may be wrong.
There's another one. There's in the Chimes of Big Ben. There's
Ah,
the Nadia, the Estonian woman, gets dragged back from the sea in a similar way. I think what they were doing was they had a problem there because the original prop, as described in the script, was a mechanical prop, which was a disaster and a mad idea. So they swiftly dropped that. So they hastily improvised the balloon, and then they have a problem of scripted scenes where in the script the mechanical prop is dragging or towing someone out of the water. And how on earth do you suggest that with a balloon? So they blew up two smaller balloons and popped them sort of on the side and use that to drag the people away, which is very inventive. And I think this is another one of those things where the gods are on their side, because if they'd stuck to the mechanical prop, which they couldn't have done, I mean, it's totally unfeasible. You couldn't make a prop like that now, let alone in the mid 60s. But the balloon is such a weird thing. It's so strange. There is nothing else in anything else that is like it, and that gives the whole thing another twist, which is very charming. So yes, I mean, I think that's what they did with those props.
yeah, the double balloon happens in the water, which means that it's probably about the physics of flotation, not some
Yeah,
sort of symbolism. So
yeah.
that's a
No, I
very
think it's just
interesting point.
I think it's just to get the idea over to the because I think if you had one balloon, you wouldn't get the idea that it was sort of pulling him. It would look odd. So they add two more to make it seem that it spawned and this is how it grabs people, which I think it does. I think that does come over, which is quite impressive, really. I mean, it's quite a hard visual sell when you think about it. How on earth, if you were presented with that, how on earth would you get around the production problem of we need to make this balloon looks like it's dragging someone through the water? I mean, that's an insane problem to have.
From the moment that he accepts this challenge to run for mayor of the village, number six is being spun around.
Yeah,
During the confrontation under the town hall, he is literally spun around while number two bangs a gavel and orders him to be tested. So number six and the viewer are both dizzy as this test begins, and
very dizzy. Yeah, yeah,
the tester turns out to be a political consultant who brainwashes him. And
yeah. Would you?
after
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
and then he becomes the perfect candidate in this scene. He becomes the prisoner of his own campaign. And the
Yeah,
thing that's what I'm asking is about the thing that snaps him out of this twice. It's the unintelligible foreign speech of his assistant. So what is going on here? Is it some sort of visionary comment on Brexit politics as the future of the UK? What's going on here?
that is. It's funny you said that because I hadn't considered that before. Um, it reminds me slightly of. I think at the height of EU immigration into Britain, there were a hell of a lot of young Eastern European women in service facing, public facing roles in Britain. And I remember somebody saying to me who was familiar with the prisoner saying, "Oh my God, it's a bit like that woman in that episode. Everywhere you go, it's like trying to make yourself understood." So I never considered that before. But I think I'm going back to that scene of the test, the truth test, after he's spun round. I mean, I think that is one of the great scenes of this episode and of the whole series. It's so beautifully done. The sound design is great. The lighting is fantastic. The actor George Benson is uncommonly good. It's so well directed. It's like it's filmic in a really good way. I mean, often when people try to make filmic television, it's tedious, but this time, no, it's absolutely fine to do that. It's a really, really well done scene, and it's also kind of baffling. It seems to be some kind of lie detector test going on as well as a brainwashing, and it's all done in symbols rather than explanatory dialogue. You know, you see questions being asked and a, a square symbol and a circular symbol moving towards a silhouette of the prisoner's head on a screen. So it's all visual and all literally symbolic, which is so odd. But yeah, he's given this campaign assistant kind of a runner by number two, who's this newly arrived Eastern European woman who apparently can't speak a word of English, but she does speak her own language, which is, for reasons which are a bit unclear, a totally fictional one. One of the things I noticed watching Danger Man again was that there are a hell of a lot of scenes in which people speak their own language in that, which is really unusual. And obviously they decided, well, we want to make this as realistic as possible. But it did sort of make me think of this. And I think maybe, McGoohan thought, well, I'm going to have this character that's Russian or Estonian or Georgian or something like that. But there may have been a question of time or resources where translating all the dialogue back and getting the actress to learn it would have been very, very time consuming, probably expensive. So he just made up a language. But interestingly, the actress who played the part said at the time, oh no, it all meant something, and he coached me through it. And there are certain words which seem to mean things. Like Laizizun means be seeing you, which is the village salutation. So I think what she's there to do is just to cause more and more confusion for him, to sort of disorient him more. We were talking about the spinning and the turning. I think she's there to kind of spin and turn him around even more, that the person that's with him all the time, he just cannot communicate with. So they've given him this kind of fairly useless assistant that he can't form any kind of relationship with, and she's very childlike. Obviously, she does turn out to be samming the whole thing and to be number two.
Yes, that to me sort of encapsulates the political paradigm by which there's the continuous revolution, that the old is always being put out by the new, and the young have their own language. Certainly in the 60s, you could make that argument that.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I think it's interesting what you said earlier about this particular moment in American history, because I think, as with all ideas and zeitgeists and things like that, we don't know where these ideas are coming from. They all seem to occur to us at the same time. There's a kind of collective, creative, unconscious. But there is definitely an element of that, and it starts to influence at the very end of the series. There's like a hippie character in the final episode. So I think that is coming in there. But against that, I think we have to remember that McGoohan was quite a staunch conservative Catholic. George Markstein, who was the script editor and kind of co-creator of the show, was a very staunch conservative. I've been reading more about him recently, and it's quite an eye-opener. He really didn't have any time he was a refugee from the Eastern Bloc himself, so he didn't have any time for any kind of left-wing thought at all. So it's interesting that they're sort of, sometimes I think because of the way it looks and the time it came out, people have seen The Prisoner as being this kind of revolutionary, progressive thing, that he was fighting against, conservative forces. But I think it's actually quite the reverse in many ways. That he's very disturbed by modernity and reality, modernity and technology and progress, and the progressive world is the world of the village. It's not, it has trappings of conservatism, but it's actually it's hiding underneath its surface a very metallic, cold world in which things are filed and numbered, etc.
The election in this episode involves a debate with megaphones. Number
Yeah,
six and number two have a public antagonism. But the whole time, number two is protecting him from real harm, right? He says,
yeah,
mustn't damage the tissue.
yeah, yeah,
Uh, and the village makes this elaborate effort to make him become the new number two in order to break his resistance by showing him that politicians are disposable and the true power will always remain hidden and unreachable to the individual person, which is
yeah,
a strikingly postmodernist thought. But it's not the
yeah. I
end of
mean,
the show, it's the
um,
premise of the show. So,
yes,
to what extent do the episodes that follow Free for All build on that premise?
I think it's interesting because I think what happens is, in general, that the early episodes, of which Free for All is one, are all about him coming to terms with the village and trying to get out of it, trying to escape. Um, I say early, but the way it was kind of scheduled all over the place. The transmission order is nothing like the production order, and the production order doesn't make sense anyway. So we have to use these terms quite loosely. Um, but I think what happens is that those early experiences, of which the free for all duffing up is one, kind of make him see that he has to go further, that this is not just a question of escaping from this place, that there's something more that needs to be done. And he starts to learn the ways of his jailers and turn them against them. So a lot of the later episodes in the production order are about him turning the tables on them, making them look stupid, um, sneaking about, doing things behind their back. So he becomes almost a part of the scenario in order to destroy it from within in a sneaky way rather than go through the normal channel of an escape story of, getting together some taps and trying to get over the wall. But I think what is interesting about the free for all project, as they call it, the village authorities, is that in a way it's just a more elaborate version of the really cruel sort of trick that um, has been played from time immemorial to prisoners in real prisons of making them think they've got away and then slamming the door in their face. So, to break their spirit, you give them a glimpse of freedom and then take it away from them. So I think that's what is happening here, that they dangle this carrot in front of him. He takes it and then they have to firm it up with some brainwashing because he would never normally go along with it. So he's kind of in this dream world where he thinks he can get out of it. And he has this moment of lucidity at the end where he starts grabbing all the controls and saying, everyone go, I'm in control, you're free, leave. And nobody bats an eyelid. And then in the most sort of untechnological, unscience fiction way, some men come in and they beat him up. So in a way, it's just like a very big, elaborate version of that kind of way of breaking a prisoner's spirit, of making somebody talk in an interrogation. It's a cliche, but like the leaving the cell door open accidentally, but not accidentally. So the person gets down the corridor and then whap, you've got them again, and you've demonstrated your power. It's like a very big version of that, which ends with an actual physical, blood coming from his mouth and men in boxing gloves bashing him in the stomach.
Speaking of freedom as a theme, one of the reasons that this show traveled well across the Atlantic, in my opinion, is
Yeah.
that opening montage in the car, because freedom of the road is a quintessentially American 20th century value. So that
Yes.
resonated.
Yeah.
And this episode worked for Americans too. And it was actually aired second in the United States in most
Yeah.
airings. And I think that it works because we share that same basic form of politics through periodic elections
Yeah.
that was invented in the UK. And it I think that helped American viewers to stay involved. As the show kind of unravels and becomes purely metaphor, it becomes sort of harder and harder to stay involved unless you have, some sort of stake in it. And I think that really helped. There's a third episode in the series, it's later on, called Living in Harmony. It's
Yeah.
set in the American Old West, and you've not written about that episode yet, but on a preliminary
No.
basis, to what extent is The Prisoner a reaction to that Cold War world of American influence, or just America? Because we saw
It's
something of
interesting. Yeah.
ourselves in it, right? What were the
Yeah.
show say? What were the show creators seeing in westerns, do you think?
In Westerns, particularly, I think it's hard to say. I mean, interestingly, Living in Harmony was not shown by ABC, or I think it was ABC or CBS showed the series, networked it in America when it first appeared in '68, I think. They pulled it. They didn't show it as one of the 17, and there's various reasons for why that might be. And people have come up with all kinds of theories, but the most obvious one to me seems to me to be that it's just a bit of a pony western. That there's only, I think there's a Canadian actor playing number two. Everyone else is British. McGoohan can get away with it because he's kind of dual citizenship, New York Irish. But I'm guessing, correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of the other accents sound a bit rotten. And it probably, and also, it's filmed in Hertfordshire, which is, there's some stock footage of the prairies or whatever at the beginning, and then it immediately cuts to like what is clearly a wooded hillock in Boreham Wood, which is near the studio. So I think that probably went against it. I mean, westerns were so popular here. Crazy popular. I mean, when I was a kid, which was a little bit later, I mean, when I was a kid in the 70s, on British TV, there was a Western on every night. Virtually every night on TV, there'd be a Western somewhere. And they were like a big traditional thing. Everyone played cowboys. We all had like spurs and cowboy hats and little cap guns. So it was a big thing over here too. But I think as regards to the American influence, we always sort of forget that the ITC shows were made almost primarily for the American primetime network slots. So they were, I mean, they started being made in color for a start, when we wouldn't have color in. The Prisoner didn't show in color in Britain until about 1972. When even then, a lot of people wouldn't have had color sets. So a lot of the Blue Grade ITC stuff was directed primarily at America. You can see that in the way that they talk sometimes, like in the Avengers, for example, which isn't an ITC show, but has a similar pedigree and heading for the same market. They say flat and they don't say flat and lift. They say apartment and elevator. So there's always that feeling that this is kind of an American, or a view of Britain for the Americans. And I think it was almost like a kind of bit of European exotica was being offered as part of this. Often a series like The Saint, Roger Moore, another ITC show, that's he's a British man, but he's hardly ever in Britain. He's always on the continent, always in Europe, never in America. So I think it was kind of being sold to America as exotic. And interestingly, apart from Living in Harmony, I think that we only ever hear one other American accent in the whole show in one episode. And that's, when you think about it, that's bizarre. But then you think of how those shows were being sold. It was kind of as an escape for Americans, something different. I mean, a couple of the shows, The Barren Man in a Suitcase, have an American star, but everyone else is British in those. So that's quite interesting. I mean, I think it's kind of looking through the different end of a telescope, if you see what I mean. That these are British shows made for an American audience about Britain. So they're coming, 2 or 3 generations down. They're not I think if The Prisoner had been made for a British audience, it would be quite different, solely a British audience. I think it would have a different feel and a different look. I think it was very much going for an American influenced, fast paced, colourful, modern, international feel. So that's what I think the American influence is there.
Another issue that resonates is globalization. The village is literally a global village. It exists because of high technology and industrial sized bureaucracy. And I have
Yeah.
likened it actually to like a table model at Davos, right? You
Yes.
have
Yeah.
Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. They're all cooing at the
Yeah.
perfect
They wish. They
sustainable building of
wish.
the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Port Merion is a first world phenomenon. It's a Welsh vacation resort, and it's a product of globalization. And number six argues for his election on the issues of one, mandatory paid vacations, and two, access
Yes.
to global goods.
Yes. Yeah.
And there is a bit of historical context that deserves mention here is that in 1967, 1968, the United Kingdom was decolonizing and de imperializing everywhere. That's
Yeah.
largely because their American cousins were putting pressure on them to do so.
And
And
also because
most,
we couldn't afford it, I think, to be honest.
yes, we
Yeah.
couldn't, the UK could not afford to be an empire anymore
Yeah.
either.
Yeah.
Um, And at this time, most adult Britons could recall the shortages and rationing of wartime to some
Yeah.
extent. So, how does this show reflect the relationship of Britain to the world at the time it was made, and how that relationship was changing? Like Britain's place in the world seems to be part of this show. Am I wrong about that, or what do you think?
No, I think you're right. I think what it's about is that that feeling of losing your identity in a kind of computerized, modernized world. Again, we forget this because it's 56 years ago now, but when you look at particularly magazines of that time, 67, 68, they're obsessed with computers. Computerization is a big thing then. Um, which is odd because we think of computers as being the early 80s silicon chips, that kind of thing. But they were a big deal then. And this is why you have those lots of scenes of the Prisoner of Lights flashing, tapes going round, um, index cards being moved along grids, that kind of thing. Um, and I think that is part of the feeling of globalization and computerization and lack of humanity. And I think that's where the feeling of the modern world is coming in. That in the Chimes of Big Ben episode, McGoohan and McKern, Leo McKern as number two, have a conversation about this. And number two says, in true Davos style, this is the future. When the two sides looking at each other realize they're looking into a mirror, the whole world will be the village. Literally actually comes out and says it. And I remember at the time, sort of growing up, seeing those episodes in the 80s, thinking, oh, that's a bit odd. That must have been a niche 60s concern that we don't really think about anymore. Oh, I was wrong. Particularly in this century, that's got more and more pronounced that you feel there's a monoculture that wherever you get off a plane, it might as well be the same place you left. Everything's becoming the same. Everything's starting to look similar. Everyone's starting to behave similarly. And things are being sort of whittled down into a globalist modern world. And people don't like that. And as we know from the sort of what are called the populist revolts, people really don't like it. They like their locality, they like their land, they like their culture. And I think the prisoner is speaking to that very early on and warning about that because the ultimate sort of dream of the village is for the whole world to be the village. And what would it be like then? It would just be, this sort of utterly controlled, computerized world where life kind of isn't worth living. No, I mean, the interesting thing there is that there isn't an ideology. This is quite interesting that because there's no communism involved, there's no capitalism involved, there doesn't seem to be any particular ideology that the village has. It's just sort of a self-reproducing progressive system of administration. That's all it is. There is nothing behind it. It is just the bureaucracy. You're not being made to particularly think anything. You're just being made to just fit in. And I think that's interesting too, because I mean, I think one of the problems we have in our age is that as human beings, we like to ascribe things that happen to people, whereas we're actually caught in I hate to say this word because it's a really annoying word usually, but we're kind of caught in a systemic trap. That, it would be easier if Klaus Schwab and Davos and the WEF were sat there like the people in the village, who they look like, moving things around on a map. But the really horrible thing is that this is kind of happening, it's sort of agglomerating, snowballing of its own accord. And that's quite terrifying, I find.
One thing that I noticed first watching the show was the cordless handsets, the telephones in the village, which the interesting thing to me was that it was only just a few years at that point that those cordless handsets had been regular consumer items. I remember, everybody having corded handsets, usually with the old rotary dials at the beginning of the 1980s. And by the end of the 1990s, that's when everybody had these cordless handsets. So the show was 20 years ahead of its time in terms of technological transfer.
It does quite a few things like that. There are trying to think of another example, but
so that brings us to the last question. What do you think is the most important thing or things about this episode that we have not discussed?
I think the thing that what's interesting about reading your article on your Substack about this episode compared to what I've written is that it made me realize how working in television, as I have done for a long time, or did do for a long time, can kind of change the way you view television, maybe in a deleterious way, because your mind was open to lots of things I didn't see. And I think what happens is that, particularly when you've worked in writing or production, which I did both, when you see a script or you see a program, you're constantly thinking about how it's technically made, how is the story coming across, should that person be there, why is that camera there, all those kind of questions. And you're missing some of the kind of magic of it. So that was interesting. But the point I'm building up to is that the one thing that really struck me this time watching this episode, which we haven't really discussed, is just how incredibly beautiful it is. Out of all the episodes in the series, it's so incredibly, it's so nice on the eyes. Even the tiniest little scenes are just so well lit. There's the scene in Act 4 or 5, Act 4, where McGoohan is in the nightclub. The nightclub scene was hacked down. It's about half the length it was in the script, but still, it's an amazing set. There's like a hat check. There's like little things on the table, little menus. Everything's done with such attention to detail for things you'll only see for a second. And then they move to a cave. So they go into Portmeirion at night along the beach, along the seafront, where there is like a path leading off to it. Then they go back to the studio, and the cave is beautiful. It's really well made. It's sort of vacuum formed material, plastic or whatever, but it looks fantastic. And it's lit beautifully, and it's got so many good props in it, and netting, and there's all this paraphernalia in there. And watching it again, it really just struck me that the production design, the props, and costumes are just so beautiful and colourful, and it's just such a work of art. Now, I normally find television trying to be beautiful a bit annoying, particularly in the age now we're now in of Netflix bloat, where you often get like really lingering long shots that you just think, oh, come on. And I think where this episode and The Prisoner gets away with it is because it's so fast that you almost get a feeling of wanting more sometimes. You think, well, I've just seen that beautiful shot for just a second. Whereas now you get lots of longers and lots of beautiful scenery, and everything's delivered with such enormous significance. And I think that's a bad thing in television generally. I think it should go fast. Because it's a small screen. However big it is, it's still a small screen.
Gareth, where can the listeners find your work?
On a Substack, I'm on at the Culture Bunker, which is where I look at The Prisoner and Blake 7. And I have another one, which I'm about to reactivate shortly, called The Age of Stupid, which is more for general political and wider cultural concerns.
Gareth Roberts, thank you so much for helping us to understand this episode. I hope you will come back soon and help us to understand maybe another episode.
That
when
would
you
be
get
great,
around to
yes.
Gareth Roberts,
Yeah.
legend of TV writing and production.
Thank you very much, Matt. That's great.
Sunday.